All right, today we're kind of talking about Greek mythology and looking at a couple of the primary sources because this is a good background to know when looking at Greek history, and especially if you're reading any of the literature. You really do need to understand some basics about the gods and the structure because it's so mixed into the literature. Like, you have it's really, you can't read any story, any play, any poem, anything, and really understand it if you don't know the basics about the gods. So we're going to start there, and then we're going to look at the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then we're going to look at Pandora's box, and kind of talk about those because that's the kind of start to the archaic period. Because remember, you have the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and when the Mycenaeans collapse, that moves Greece into a dark age. And these stories came out of the Dark Age. They were oral tales and traditions during the Dark Age that really mixed Dark Age culture with Mycenaean culture. And then the Archaic period starts with the emergence of writing. So actually, let me put that down first here. We'll just do it up here, and then I'll write with the gods afterwards, just so you have a clear kind of cut idea of the timeline for that. So you have the Minoans, which are around 2600s. This is all kind of circa to 1250 BCE. And then you have the Mycenaeans, that were from around 2000 or 2000. Well, they were around because they were around during right. That wasn't the height of their power, though. Remember, they took over around 1250 BC, but they were around from 2000 to 1150 BCE, right? And this is the collapse. Now, remember, I said the 1200 BCE date. With collapse, right? That's just circa that time, and 1150 fits into that time frame. Then that leads to the Dark Ages, which is from around 1100 to 750 BCE, and right from that then is where you have the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And Pandora's box. That then emerges, though, that's going to mark the Archaic period when it gets put down in writing, but they were created during the Dark Ages. And the Archaic period is from 750 to around 550 BCE. And then you have the Classical and Hellenistic, right? So the Classical period, that's at the height of Athens and Sparta, and that's from 550 to around 323 BCE, and then to the Hellenistic period starts 323 BCE. Okay, so that's the time frame of that line there for that, just so we have a clear idea. Now for the gods, we're going to look at this list in just a second that I have up there. What I want to talk about first is kind of the order of the gods, if you will, so that you can get a sense of where everyone fits in. So the first were the Titans. And the Titans ruled before the Olympians. They are actually the parents of some of the Olympians. And then when, so what actually happens with the Titans is this, so the Titans were ruling, and you have Kronos that was the father of Zeus and Poseidon and Hera, and he got like a prophecy that said that his children would overthrow him. So he started consuming them, kind of just swallowing them whole. He didn't chew, because that's important for later, I suppose. And so his wife was understandably not happy with that, Gaia, and so she ends up in order to save one of her kids, which happens to be Zeus, she wraps a rock in a blanket, and when she gives birth and then presents the baby to Kronos, he just swallows it whole like he's done. And so then Zeus is able to grow up quickly, because apparently he's a god, and he then kills his father, frees his siblings, and they overthrow the Titans. And then that is why Zeus becomes king of the gods, and then you have the Olympians, and then they're going to have children, which are going to be part of the Olympians. Some of them are going to be part of the Olympians as well. So the Titans technically were first, and they ruled first. They often get described as cruel, although we'll see Prometheus, who is a Titan, helps humans. So they're not all bad, but they often in Greek mythology tend to be more demonized, in part because of the idea that the Olympians were the main gods. So the Titans were there, but they're not really there anymore. It's now the Olympians that rule. And the list that we have here, which we'll go over in a minute, are the Olympians. Then you have minor deities, right? So because the religion was polytheistic, like the polytheistic that we've looked at thus far, and that you give sacrifices to the gods. There's hundreds of gods. So you have the main Olympians, and that's got a specific list here. But then you have hundreds and hundreds of minor deities that also come into myths and stories, right? And those are the ones we're not going to look at because it's not as important for understanding. The Olympians are the ones that play a role in all Greek literature, and you really do need to know what they do and who their characteristics to understand the literature. Then you have demigods. And demigods are part human, part god. So Achilles, Hercules, those are demigods. And then you have kind of three smaller groups, which we can just put as minor female or minor goddesses. But they're not as distinct as like minor deities. So these are even lower on the list. You have like earth goddesses that are related to the earth, kind of like Mother Earth goddesses. You have muses and furies, and they're all female deities. And the furies are vengeful spirits. The muses are ones that inspire artists and poets and mathematicians, and there's ones for, like I said, poetry, math, philosophy, so on and so on. So there's different muses for each of those categories, and so they are gods, but they're very, very lower level gods. Like, so they're under the demigods, really. So that's the order of things, right? And a lot of the demigods show up in mythology as well. Like I said, Achilles and Hercules are two good examples of that. The minor deities do in some, the Olympians in everything, and then the Furies and the Muses are more often just referenced, but they don't really have their own personality. Neither do the Furies. Like the Earth goddesses, Circe in Calypso are kind of, they're in the Odyssey, and I'll mention them briefly. They're kind of like that type of god. So they have a little more personality in those stories, but they're again often mentioned where it's more like they serve as a function to explain something, or to vengeful spirits to chase Orestes after he's killed his mother Clytemnestra. They're like a purpose to move the story forward, to explain kind of aspects in the world, more than in having a full-fledged out personality. Whereas the Olympians and the minor deities, well, the Olympians and the demigods tend to have a lot. So the ones you see the most are the Olympians and the demigods. And then occasionally minor deities pop in and out. Narcissist is one. Right, so we get the word of someone being a narcissist from Narcissus, who was a god who was so enamored by his looks that he constantly stared into his reflection in the water, right? And so what's interesting, because we get those words, like Achilles' heel, right? We call our Achilles' heel that because that's the part on Achilles that his mom held him in when she dipped him in the river Styx to make him more strong, and more impervious to damage or death, I suppose. Okay, so let's look at the gods. Right, you have Zeus first, and Zeus is, and it gives you the Roman name here, but Zeus is the king of the gods, right? And then what I liked about this is it gives you the symbol. So a lot of times in Greek literature, as well as the sculptures, right, they identify the gods by these symbols, and that they're descriptors that they often put with it in some way. Like Athena is often described as gray-eyed Athena. And that's meant to showcase this idea of being wise and stuff. Or, and like I said, when you have sculptures and other things like that, Zeus is shown with a lightning bolt. So Zeus is the king of the gods. Hera is his wife here. And not only is she married to him and queen of the gods, it doesn't mention this one here, but she's also a queen of, her kind of thing is childbirth. And then Poseidon is a king of the seas. So Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and there's two that aren't on here that should be, Hades and then Hestia, right? And Dionysus, you could put in parentheses, and I'll mention why in a minute. So Hades, let me put what they are. So Hades is king of the underworld, right? And Hestia is of the hearth, the home and hearth, right? Okay, so these ones, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, Hestia, they're like the original, they're the children of the Titans. So they're the older Olympian gods. The other gods listed here are the children in various ways, or connected. Although Demeter is also one of the older gods as well. So we could put this here with her. Okay, so Poseidon's king of, so just to distinguish, right? Because it's very much distinguished. The older gods that are children of the Titans are often displayed as older, described as older, where their children are seen as like in their early 20s often, and they're kind of in that perpetual state of parents and children of the gods, but young adult children, right? So Demeter is goddess of agriculture, or harvest is the other one that's often mentioned. Apollo is a god of music, prophecy, the sun, and as well. He's often called the sun god. And the laurel wreath or bow and arrow is his symbol. Artemis is, Apollo and Artemis are twins. Artemis is the hunt children, also virginity. And bow and arrow are her things. The goddess of the hunt is very common, but also, like I said, virginity with her. Like there's a story where, I'll bring this one, we'll talk about this one again when we talk about women, but like this human woman is being chased by this man who is planning on raping her. So she prays to the goddess Artemis, because of the goddess virginity, to save her. And Artemis ends up turning her into a weeping willow tree, which is probably not what she hoped when she meant save her and save her virginity. She's saved, I suppose, but she's turned into a tree. But the weeping willow, that's like, it kind of explains this idea of why the willow tree looks like it's crying. There's another story too about how she's the goddess of the hunt, and yet she's super protective of like animals and nature. And when this guy was coming onto the land and was hunting one of her stags, then he is ruthlessly killed for doing so. So it's this kind of contradictory nature. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. It says war, and war is definitely part of that. Not like Ares, who's the god of war. Like she's not. Ares is the more aggressive god of war. Athena is more like the goddess of war that fights when there is war, but she's not the one antagonizing or trying to start wars, where Ares is always kind of described as enjoying war and trying to start conflict in war. You could almost put that Ares is like the god of conflict and war, where Athena is definitely more wisdom, and then war is a secondary thing. The owl is often her thing. Athena has a really interesting story. So Athena, well, let me go through the rest, and I'll tell a couple of the interesting stories. So Ares is the god of war. Aphrodite is the goddess of love. She's like the Mesopotamian Ishtar, and Inanna and Ishtar, right? That's her role, the fertility, but also love, sex, beauty. Hermes is the messenger god. He's got the ones with the wing sandals that lets him go quickly to and from. Hephaestus is the smith god, or god of metalworking. He's the one that like creates all the weapons for the gods. So he's super important, even though he's rarely mentioned, because he's making all of the weapons and armor for the gods. So there's two of the stories that are probably the most interesting. Well, Aphrodite is interesting with a lot of her stories. Athena has an interesting story. So does Hephaestus. So Athena and Hephaestus have the most interesting kind of birth stories. Athena was that it's connected to this idea that Zeus got this woman pregnant. So Zeus also would visit human women or demigods and other forms and have sex with them, and some of them got pregnant, which creates demigods. Athena doesn't become a demigod though, because while her mother is pregnant with her, she asks, Zeus says, what is one thing I can give you? She says she wants to see his true form. He says you can't, because then, no mortal can see my true form. She wants it anyway. So he gives it to her, which then kills her, burns her up. But before, that destroys the baby, he cuts Athena out of the her mother's stomach, and she's like a fetus at this point, puts it in his head, right? None of this is scientifically logical at all. And then she is later born out of Zeus's head, which is why she's the goddess of wisdom. And so this is often described, and so then they kind of like reject and kind of ignore that she had a mother at all. And then it's said that Zeus gave birth out of his head to Athena. But she's the closest to Zeus. Like, she's definitely his favorite child by far, and she's probably one of the more powerful goddesses because of that. But it connects to why she's a goddess of wisdom, because he gave birth to her out of his head. Well, the story goes in with Hephaestus is that Hera, who's the goddess of childbirth, besides queen of the gods, is pissed off that Zeus gave birth to a child without her, when that's her freaking role. She's like, wait a minute, I'm the goddess of childbirth. That's not your role at all. So she gives birth to Hephaestus without a man to prove that she can do it too. Hephaestus is born, but he's described as the lame god. His foot is deformed. So all of the gods and goddesses are always described in a sense of perfection, that they all look like the ideal, the most possible, perfect, ideal human form. Except for Hephaestus, who is often described as not looking ideal, and especially because he's marked in this way by having a deformed foot, which then is sent to kind of mock Hera or remind Hera that she isn't as powerful as Zeus. And yet he is one of the more important gods that's not mentioned because of what he provides for them. Aphrodite is actually married to Hephaestus, but she has a relationship with Ares, the god of war, right? So there's all these, everything is interconnected into that. But like I said, Athena and Hephaestus have, like I said, very interesting birth stories, because they're both they're connected to this idea of both being born from just one parent. And then in completely different direction and how that gets them. And then Dionysus is the god of wine and parties. He comes in later, though. He is a later god. So, like, he's not in the original list of Olympians. Later in Greek history, Dionysus shows up and then gets put into... So he's kind of like the youngest of all the gods, even though the children Olympians all are around the same age and how they're described as, like said, early 20s. He's still the youngest of all the gods because he comes in later. So that's why he's in parentheses, because he wasn't there in the beginning at all, and only later is brought into it. And Hestia is often forgotten. She is like I said, they're siblings. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hades, Hestia are all siblings, children of the Titans. And Hestia is often kind of pushed off that list, and she's not mentioned in much literature. Whereas Hades, the god of the underworld, is Poseidon, Hera, Zeus. Demeter is not much either. She's the mother of Persephone, who ends up going into the underworld part of the time, which, much like the descent of Ishtar, the story of Persephone is very, very similar. That she ends up to save her mother, goes into the underworld for part of the time, and when she comes up to visit her mother, that's the explanation for seasons changing. So it's just a different kind of background for what's going on, but a very similar thing. And so she ends up having to marry Hades, and is queen of the underworld for part of the year. But outside of that, Demeter's not mentioned too often in literature. So like I said, you probably at least familiar with Demeter and Hestia, and Hephaestus, even though he's around a lot and just very, very briefly mentioned. Like we'll see, he's mentioned in Pandora's box. He helps create her. And that's usually his role. He's mentioned briefly, he builds something for the gods, and then the story moves on. But his backstory is very interesting. Okay, so those are the Olympians. Like I said, just knowing this general list, because, for example, in the Odyssey, Odysseus talks about Poseidon. The Cyclops is actually a child of Poseidon. Poseidon plays a huge role for anyone on the ships and being able to travel on the sea. And all of the gods intervene in the Iliad. And even Athena intervenes on behalf of Odysseus in the Odyssey. So the gods play a role in showing up. The Olympians pick sides, especially the children. They pick sides in the Iliad, and they help their favored humans. The gods, though, kind of like the Greek gods aren't as harsh as Mesopotamian gods, but like they're still kind of fickle. Like they have favored humans, and if you are a favored human, then it is great to have the gods on your side because they go out of their way to help you. And we'll see Athena helps Achilles. Athena helps Odysseus a ton. Apollo and Artemis get involved and stuff, and Ares, of course, is there as well. And if you're a favored human, great. If you're not, then it sucks for you, because if you happen to be in the way of a favored human, the gods often help that human and you end up dead. Otherwise, they kind of... the humans are kind of insignificant to them if it's not one of their favored humans. If it's someone they really like, then you're important and they pay attention and they try to help you. Otherwise, you're an insignificant human. But they aren't cruel and capricious in the same way that the Mesopotamian gods were. They're not overly friendly and caring unless you're a favored human. Although the Greeks, like I said, they definitely felt that they could pray to them and that the gods would help them if they, were doing the proper thing. So they're definitely nicer than Mesopotamian gods, but you see some of that lack of awareness and how they're impacting other humans' lives when they're helping their favored humans. And that they have their own games and their own squabbles with each other, which often impact the human world, unbeknowingly to humans in literature and stories. Okay, so that's the gods. It gives you some background on that for the stories. So what I want to look at is the Odyssey and the Iliad. So let's look at the Iliad first, right? This is about the Trojan War. And I gave the background from it during the Zoom meeting and stuff. So I'm not going to go into all the full background again, other than to say, right, that this gets started. The Trojan War is between the Greeks and the Trojans. And you have the reason for this has to do with Helen and Paris. Helen is the wife of Menelaus. And remember, Menelaus and Agamemnon are Mycenaean kings, and she's married to Menelaus. Paris is Prince of Troy, and he and Helen fall in love, or he takes her. There's various versions of that, and she goes back to Troy with him. This kickstarts off a whole war where the Greeks are against the Trojans, and various kings who had made a pact with when they were competing for Helen's hand end up fighting, which includes Odysseus and others. Achilles did not make this pact, but he wants to go for his own reasons. And the war lasted, it was 10 years of war. And the story, where the story starts at, we'll say 9.5 years into the war. So we don't get right the whole war. We're coming into that story at the very tail end of the story. So what I want to do is look at the theme. Actually, so let me just give the key aspects of the. I'm trying to make, because there's a lot to talk about with Odysseus. I'll just talk about with the Odyssey real quick, and then we'll look at some of the sources. And as we're doing that, I'll list some of the themes, because what I want you to get out of this is, I mean, the stories, they're both very interesting, and I highly recommend reading them at some point when you have time. But the key is that there's specific themes that are important part of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and those themes are things that the Greeks definitely used within their culture. These books were used as educational books for young boys when they were being educated, and these were definitely important qualities and characteristics in Greek culture. So it really is important to know the basics of the Odyssey and the Iliad in order to know the themes and understand Greek culture. So I said the Greeks and the Trojans, 10 years at war. The story comes in 9.5 years in. I'm going to kind of talk about some of that as we go. And then you have, because I guess I'm going to do Iliad and Odyssey, because I'm not going to separate the themes out between the two. And then with the Odyssey, you have the Odyssey is off after the Trojan War, and it's going to be about Odysseus and his family. In the end, it's mostly about Odysseus, and then his family comes in at the very end. Actually, the book has ended. So what's interesting with the Odyssey is it starts with Telemachus, and Telemachus is Odysseus's son, and he was an infant when Odysseus left, and is now 19, almost 20 years old at the start of the Odyssey, because Odysseus is not only gone for the 10 years of the Trojan War, but then Odysseus ends up gone for 10 more years on this adventure / lost series. And so what's interesting is it starts with Telemachus, and then it goes from there, it goes to Odysseus near the end of his journey. So what actually happens is it starts off with Telemachus in trouble and Penelope, Odysseus's wife, because there are suitors living in the palace trying to marry Penelope. And they've been there for a while because everyone assumes Odysseus is dead. And they're planning on killing Telemachus. So Athena goes and visits him disguised as an old man and basically suggests he should go to Menelaus and see anything he can learn. And it's mostly to get him out of there so that he doesn't get killed. And he treats her well, even though it's an older man stranger. He brings her in, her in a disguise as a man, gives her food, before, and finding out what he needs or she needs and all of that, right? Which is going to be one of the themes, which is hospitality. And we'll talk a little bit more about hospitality in a minute. And so she's also pleased with him because he's has proper behavior, where we'll see that's contrasted to the suitors who have no proper behavior. And then he goes to Menelaus, and then they tell what they remember and stories about Helen, about the Trojan War, about Odysseus. Then it skips to Odysseus washed up on the shore, and this is after all of his adventures and crazy times, and he's naked, and this princess is walking by, and he's like, kind of pops out and scares her because it's a crazy naked man, but finally convinces her that he's someone important, that he's a king, so that she brings him back to the castle, and then he tells his story. Right? So then you get his story, which goes back in time, and he relays all the events that happened to him. Then it goes back to the present, and then he travels to Ithaca, his home. And there then he meets up reunited with his family. Right, so it's this interesting narrative of how they did it, which they're booked in with, right? Instead of just saying it from start to finish, right? You're in present day with Telemachus and then Odysseus, and then you go back in time where he relays his whole story, and then you get back up in present day. So it's bookend, right? With like the present day, past story, present day. That was like a whole new narrative technique that hadn't been done before. And so then like the main part of the Odyssey though is all about his travels and where he was for 10 years. Okay, so those are like very briefly, like that doesn't tell much. We're going to look into it when we look at the excerpts from the story. And then what we're going to put here for this is the themes that we're going to talk about. Obviously, the first one that I'm going to mention is war, and most specifically because we're going to talk about the Iliad first, the realities of war. One of the things that the Iliad does well is that, right, the good and bad of war, the realities of war, they don't shy away from, war is not glorified. In fact, it often talks about the horrors of war and how people, women, children, families are hurt because of war. It talks about looting and things like that. So, that's with the Iliad. The overarching theme isn't war is a glorious good thing. In fact, almost everyone is negatively impacted by war in this story. And then the good part is not so much like that warfare is good, but that what do they get out of it, right? So here, let me just do some of them because we're going to get right into that. And then we'll continue on with it. So the what do they get out of war? And that gets connected to, one, looting, and pillaging, essentially. Like people didn't go to war for country yet. Like there's no city-state pride. Like Sparta and Athens and fighting for your city-state comes later. In the early archaic period, in the Dark Ages period, you didn't fight for that so much as you fought for personal glory. and honor, right? And so you have two things. You also have time, which is this a sense of honor and glory. You fought to be remembered. And this is going to come up in the Odyssey too. There was the belief with this that, right, if you wanted to be immortal, right, one of the ways that humans could be immortal was to be remembered, to have your name, to achieve honor, enough honor and glory that you would be remembered and your name would live on forever. Well, there's the immortality. And they constantly are talking about it in the Iliad and the Odyssey about like not wanting to be forgotten. In fact, remember Achilles' story, he's given the prophecy. You can either go to Troy and you'll have honor and glory and fame and you will always be remembered by everyone will know your name, but you're going to die there. Or you can stay home and you will have a family, you'll have children, you will have a good life, but you will only be remembered by your family and no one else will remember the name Achilles. And he chooses that one, the other one, to go to Troy, knowing that he's going to die because he wants that honor and glory and he wants to be remembered. Now, we'll see when we talk about this a little bit later, Odysseus meets him in the underworld and things change. But once you're dead, apparently, then it's not so great. But that's a huge thing. And Odysseus is going to talk about it too. I can't stay. I have to go. I have to get home because otherwise my name will be forgotten. So that's constantly this. But this is how you become immortal, right? Not literally, just your name lives on forever. And that was super important and something that the Greeks reference, actual like historical Greeks reference in various things. Alexander the Great thought it was important. Even in Athens and Sparta, they talk about it a lot. And probably even more Sparta than Athens because of that warrior mentality. And then the other one is arete, and we're going to look at this when we look at Greek sculptures. But this is this idea of excellence, and it's definitely part of that idealized, the best ideal human potential. Right, the best that you can be, that whatever you're doing, you should do it in the best way that you can do. And arete comes up with all of the, and we'll see throughout. And then also, like when we look at the philosophies in Greek sculptures, it's in those as well. Okay, so that's the start. That's not all of them, but those are ones that we're looking at right off the bat. So let's look here. Oh, we're going to look at that in just a second. So we have, this is from the excerpts of the Iliad and Odyssey that we're going to talk about. The first one here is the wrath of Achilles. And remember, I said that this would, the best, like, translation would start with the thing rage Achilles, and they cut it off here because there's a little bit before this, but the line is rage Achilles. So you're introduced to the Iliad with rage Achilles. Achilles is pissed. We're 9.5 years into war and Achilles is pissed, and so this is the story between him and Agamemnon. All right, so the wrath of Achilles, right? Rage Achilles, he's pissed. So then it brings us into what happens. The backstory for this, and because it jumps right into it, is that Agamemnon, who's kind of a jerk, and you'll see it in here, he had taken the daughter of a priest of Apollo when they raided an area. In fact, he didn't raid much, and Achilles mentions that, like that, you're not doing anything. But he takes the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and tradition was as well, women were, and this will get into the other theme, which I'll put in a minute, is women. And women are shown here and in Pandora's box, and a lot in the Odyssey and the Iliad. That gives us a really good, robust view of how the Greeks viewed women. But women were considered loot. If you conquered or took an area, women were fair game to capture, and you were then free to rape them, to keep them as a slave, do whatever you wanted to them. So he took the daughter. Well, one of the traditions was, though, that if they offered a reasonable ransom, you were supposed to give them back. So that doesn't really work for lower class families, but the wealthy and upper nobility, and that definitely fits with like Dark Age, early archaic period views of nobility, is that if they had the money and they offered a reasonable ransom, then you were supposed to give them back. So the priest, this girl's father, and she was older. I say girl, but really like young woman. He offered Agamemnon ransom, and Agamemnon, against what they were supposed to do, refuses. So understandably, the father's pissed. So he prays to Apollo to put a curse on the Greeks, and things start going badly. And so all of the war council of the Greeks convenes, and they have a guy that is kind of like a seer, and that can kind of communicate with the gods and know what's going on. So they bring him in, and he says, the gods this curse, this bad luck we've been having, because the Greeks had, things have been going well, and all of a sudden everything starts going poorly. There's sicknesses and stuff. And he's like, all of this is happening because Agamemnon dishonored the gods by not giving back the girl when a proper ransom was given. And so Apollo is now cursing us because of this. And so they're like, you need to give her back. You need to give her back now. And you don't get the ransom either. Now you just have to give her back, because if we don't give her back, we're going to continue to suffer. It is bad to have a god put a curse on you. And he gets upset and is like, no way. And then finally he's like, fine, but I'm taking Achilles' prize, which was another woman that he had taken that he really liked. And so that's why rage Achilles. And Achilles is like, hell no. And so this is their big argument about it, right? So he says, you think that I should give, so this is Agamemnon, Achilles, though you may be a great man, don't think I will fall for that. I will not be outwitted or bullied by you. You think that I should give up the girl while you keep your prize safe? So that's that, right? He should give up his girl while Achilles gets to keep his. Do you expect me to sit calmly while you rob me? Let the Greeks find me a suitable prize that I like in fair exchange, or I will simply take your own or that of Ajax or Odysseus. So this kind of sets the scene for Agamemnon to being a jerk. He's basically, because as much as the whole issue of taking women as loot and prizes and stuff, but like all these other people, they're fighting and actually out there, and Agamemnon just is directing everyone, and he's just taking stuff from people, right? And so then he says, we can worry about that later, though. Let's get a ship to sea and outfit her with a special crew and include a few sacrifices and semi-prize. So he finally relents and says, yeah, I have to give her back because of pissing off Apollo, but I'm going to take your prize. Achilles scowled at him and answered, you insolent bastard, always filled with arrogance and greed. I can't imagine why the Greeks support you at all as they head into battle or on raiding parties, right? So he does not think highly of Agamemnon, right? And then he says, right, the truth is we joined this expedition to please you, you insufferable bastard, to fight the Trojans because of your shameless arrogance and for your idiot brother Menelaus. You just don't understand. And now you have threatened to rob me of the prize for which I have fought and which the sons of the Greeks have given me. And then he even says, like, you don't do any of the fighting. And Achilles was this great fighter, and he says to please him, and Achilles wasn't really fighting to please Agamemnon, but Achilles was fighting for his own personal reasons, but everyone wanted to use him, and Agamemnon references that he used Achilles a lot in battles. In fact, one of the scenes from Troy that I want to show here, and then we'll continue with this source, is at the beginning of the movie Troy. And it shows Achilles fighting as a champion fighter. So this was something that was done in the ancient world. I mentioned it with the Hebrews when we talked about David and Goliath as an example, that you would pick a champion. So one of the things to save lives and avoid a lot of people dying was to have two champions fight. And then the agreement is that whoever won that battle, then that side won the battle. They usually didn't decide an entire war over it, but it could often end a battle for the day, and it often saved lives. So this scene here Not that one. This one here is at the beginning of the movie Troy, and is showing Achilles in that function, fighting for Agamemnon and Menelaus, but as like a champion. But I like this scene because it shows already the contentious nature that he has towards Agamemnon. Menelaus is always seen as the lesser bad brother. He isn't as he doesn't have as much arrogance and hubris as Agamemnon does. Even though here he's not in the source, right? Achilles insulted Menelaus as well. So let's watch this real quick just to get an idea. And like I said, the fact that these champion fights did actually happen historically.
Perhaps we should have our war tomorrow when you're better rested.
That's Agamemnon.
I should have you whipped for your impudence.
Perhaps you should fight him.
Achilles. Achilles. Look at the men's faces. You can save hundreds of them. You can end this war with a swing of your sword. Think how many songs they'll sing in your honor. Let them go home to their wives.
Imagine a king who fights his own battles. Wouldn't that be a sight? Of all the warlords loved by the gods, I hate him the most.
We need him, my king.
For now.
Okay, so like I said, that one just shows kind of the contentious nature of Agamemnon and Achilles, but it mentioned several of the major themes. He's talking about, remember, people will be singing your names and how many songs to be remembered, that personal glory and to be remembered. And then it's also, he's, asking them to think about the men not dying and that the realities of warfare. Okay, so they already have there's lots of stories that talk about them having a very contentious relationship, and he clearly doesn't like him here. And then Agamemnon here, down right here, says, right, since Apollo is taking Chryseis from me, which is the girl, I shall send her with my ship and my followers, but I shall come to your tent and take your own prize, the beautiful Briseis, so that you may realize how much more powerful I am than you. This pushed Achilles over the edge. His heart was divided between two options: draw his sword, push the other aside, and kill Agamemnon, or restrain himself and check his anger. And he ends up starting to draw his sword from the scabbard. And Athena, right, the goddess that likes him, appears. She's only visible to him and no one else can see him. And he realizes it's her because she grabs his arm to stop him from killing Agamemnon. And he's like, why are you here? To see the arrogance of Agamemnon? Let me tell you, and you know I will follow through on this. He shall pay for this insolence with his life. And then she says, slow down, Achilles, and obey me. And basically says, don't kill him right now. right? That's not going to be helpful. Slow down. So he checked his great hand on the silver hilt of his sword and thrust it back into the scabbard. So he ends up, so right, Athena, there's the goddess, right? She intervenes in this scene and stops Achilles from killing Agamemnon. Not for Agamemnon, but for Achilles and the Greeks. And so then they insult each other, and then you have the guy that had come in to like tell him why the gods were upset, right? The seer. This is him saying this. Mark my words, for I am taking a solemn oath. The day is coming when all the Greeks will miss Achilles on the field of battle. You will look and not find him. You will be powerless. So this is foreshadowing what happens, which is that Achilles stops fighting. Right? He eventually just gets completely upset with Agamemnon and just says, fine, me and my men are not going to fight anymore. Good luck winning the battle without me. And that's going to set the scene for what happens next. Okay, so this scene is really just showing the tensions between that, the fact that the gods intervene, which is one of the themes that we'll add to it is the gods, and not only respect for the gods, but their role in human life. But then also, again, the arrogance they're talking about is definitely part of that hubris, excessive pride, which is another one of those themes. So I'll add those two. I'm going to go through the ones here with the Iliad first, and then I'll add the rest of those themes. The next one is the death of Hector, but there's a few things that happen in between. So what happens is Achilles ends up refusing to fight because of this whole event. Technically, the curse gets lifted after the daughter of the priest is given back. But now, once the men finally recover, the Greeks finally recover, Achilles and his men aren't fighting anymore. And so the Greeks end up still not doing well because Achilles was like kind of the main motivator and just like, they showed the men cheering and it got them all wanting to fight, right? He was a huge motivator for men fighting because if Achilles is on your side, you can't lose. And so the morale was down. They were losing because Hector, who was the older brother of Paris and Prince of Troy, was known as a really good fighter, and they couldn't take the city of Troy anyways. Their walls were too strong, and Hector's general plan for fighting was stay close to the walls. Now, what this had allowed the Greeks to do this whole time was raid the surrounding towns and cities, but the main city of Troy they could not breach, which is why this war took so long. And so lots of bad things happen in between this, and what ends up happening is Patroclus, which in the book is described as Achilles' lover. In the movie, it's just talked about as his cousin, I think. But he's described in the book as his lover. He gets frustrated that Achilles isn't fighting, so one day he sneaks on Achilles' armor, which is very noticeable. Everyone, when they see it, knows it's Achilles. And he goes out and fights. And then the people see that Achilles is fighting, and so the Greeks get a rallying cry and start fighting well. Hector is out on the battlefield, and he sees what he thinks is Achilles, because the Patroclus has all of Achilles' armor on. And so he goes and fights him, and he wins. Only after he kills him does he realize that he didn't kill Achilles, he killed Patroclus. And then he's like, crap, because everyone knew who he was, and he knew that Achilles was going to be pissed. He ends up taking his armor, because again, spoils of war. And so this next scene then is Hector or Achilles gets pissed again. Like when he finds out that Patroclus is dead, he goes on a rampage, really. And so then he goes to the city walls of Troy and just yells Hector's name over and over again and challenges him. And so this is this scene with Hector fighting Achilles. Priam is the king of Troy, and he says, Hector, I beg you not to face this man alone, or you will die at the hands of Achilles, for he is far stronger than you and a savage. So come inside the walls to be the guardian of the Trojan men and women, or you will throw away your life a victim of the son of Peleus. Have pity on your wretched father, for while I'm still alive and able to feel. And then this is again the realities of war. right? So Priam's begging Hector not to go here. So much tragedy to witness before I die. The massacre of my sons, my daughters raped, their bedrooms pillaged, their babies murdered amid the rage of battle, and my sons' wives hauled away by the cruel hands of the Greeks. In the end, the fierce dogs of war will tear me to pieces at my own gates after someone has beaten the life out of my body with sword or spear. So, Priam had multiple sons and daughters, and they didn't all live in the city wall. And he had lost most of his sons and daughters either to battle or to these pillaging that took place in the cities surrounding it. And so he's telling him, like, I've already experienced all of this loss and misery of sons killed, daughters raped, grandchildren and babies killed because they did kill children in battles and things like that. I can't, please don't go, you will die. And others had told Hector too. Hector was like the, leader of the military. His wife had a previous conversation with him about, like, if you die, our son will be killed and I will be raped and made a slave. Like, you have to live because this is the consequence of this. And again, so there's the realities of war, of not just like the glory and the honor and the prizes, the looting that you get, but that there's also the sacrifice and negative to everyone. It impacts everyone. Hector says, that he's going to be criticized if he retreats into the walls. And then he says, surely someone would surely say, Hector ruined us by his own arrogance. Of course, it'd be better for me to return after having fought Achilles and killed him, or to have died gloriously here before the walls of Troy. So here you have a couple of things. You have that hubris, or claiming, right, that it's hubris if he went inside, but also this idea of glory and honor, which is the time, right? That he needs to do this for his honor. And so he goes, so if we skip, right, he continues his speech. But then it says here, right, as Hector thought things through, Achilles drew near him as if he were a god of war himself in his flashing helmet. Over his right shoulder he brandished his terrible ash spear, and bronze gleamed around him like flashing fire of the sun. Hector looked up and began to tremble. Now, see, the ... is an excerpt. They cut off parts, because then the next scene is Hector speaking to Achilles. So Hector goes out to meet him and then freaks out and starts running away from him around the walls of Troy. And he actually runs around Troy 3 times before he gets tired and stops, and then finally decides to fight him. They don't show that in the movie Troy, because of course it doesn't make Hector look quite the hero if he's running away from him. But again, the realities of that. He freaks out. He doesn't want to die. He runs away. And Achilles chases him. And then after like running around 3 times, then they have a talk. And it says, though I have been chased 3 times around the mighty city of Priam without daring to confront you, I shall no longer run, for I am resolved to stand and fight, kill or be killed. But first, let's make a deal with your God as witness, I with mine. If Zeus gives me strength and I kill you, I will not commit any atrocities to your body, but will only strip you of your armor and give your body to the Greeks. Will you do the same for me? This is importance of proper burial. That there was, that you had to be buried a certain way in order to go to the underworld. And so one of the ways that you could insult and the final insult to someone was to prevent them from having a proper burial. And then their soul would be forced, their shade as it was called, would be roaming without being able to get into the underworld. And that was seen as a horrible thing. And so he's like, can we, not only that proper burial, but respect for the gods in terms of doing the right thing with proper burial, right? And he's like, can we do that? And then Achilles says, Hector, are you mad? You must be insane to offer such a pact. There can be no terms between lions and men, just as the wolf will never see eye to eye with the lamb. It is the natural order, enemies to the end. There can be no understanding between you and me, no deal. So Achilles Again, that's going to go to hubris here. He refuses. He has such excessive pride, and he's pissed that he's like, no, I'm not going to be respectful to your proper burial rites, or to the, to the gods. And so then they fight, and this is where they fight, and Achilles kills him. And then it says that though he was still able to speak, and as his life ebbed out of him, Hector said to Achilles, I am at your knees and beg you in the name of your parents, do not let the dogs devour my body near the Greek ships. My parents will give you gold and treasures, and just send my body home so that the Trojans can hold funeral rites when I'm dead. So again, proper funeral rites. This is also, again, that expectation of the doing the proper customs and things that right, that they had customs for this, of they'd offer a ransom for his body. He should have obliged that. Dog, don't talk to me of knees or parents. If I could, I would cut your flesh into pieces and eat it raw for all the pain you have caused me. Nothing will save you from the dogs. Even if Priam should offer me your weight in gold, your mother shall never lay eyes on you again. To lament the son she bore, the dogs and vultures will devour your body. And then he says right here, nevertheless, think, this is Hector, before you act, in case you anger the gods and they remember how you treated me. Your turn will come. Though you are a great fighter, you will be brought down. So again, respect to the gods, and that important part of that. Then Achilles strips him of his armor and abuses his body, it says, which is just, he slits his tendons in the back of his feet and his heels, and he slips a leather strap through. He basically ties him up and then ties him to the back of his chariot. And then it talks about Hector's body being dragged behind the chariot with all of the people from Troy to see. Andromache was his wife. She when we get to women, we'll talk about her. She, along with Penelope, are kind of seen as the ideal women in the Iliad and the Odyssey, whereas all other women are seen as the negative view of women. So there's only 2 women in all of the Odyssey and Iliad that are seen as positive: her and Penelope. Okay, so that's that scene. So let's watch this on Troy. Obviously, you'll see they don't show him running around, because that doesn't fit with the movie. So this is the scene that we just looked at. And that's Hector.
I've seen this moment in my dreams. I'll make a pact with you. With the gods as our witnesses, let us pledge that the winner will allow the loser all the proper funeral rituals.
There are no pacts between lions and men. Now you know who you're fighting.
I thought it was you I was fighting yesterday. And I wish it had been you. But I gave the dead boy the honor he deserved.
You gave him the honor of your sword. You won't have eyes tonight. You won't have ears or a tongue. You will wander the underworld blind, deaf, and dumb, and all the dead will know. This is Hector, the fool who thought he killed Achilles. let a stone take my glory.
Okay, and then it cuts off there, but then it's where they he drags away, and there we go, pause that. Didn't want to pause, sorry, hang on. Alright, try to get this paused here. Of course, doesn't want to pause now. Come on. Apparently my computer wants to stop working here. So then the scene that it doesn't show, of course, is that, oh, finally. Then it shows this scene where Achilles takes him on the, hang on here, sorry. It's still going. Puts him ties a chariot and then takes him away. There we go. It did not want to pause there. Okay, had to put the keyboard back on for a second. All right, we'll come back to that one here. So let me get the let's talk about the various themes that we did there, and then I'll that's the end of those excerpts. So I'll just tell you kind of the ending of that. So we also have then, right, the gods. And what we can put with that is respect for the gods. And that's definitely mentioned in various ways. But then also how the gods intervene in human affairs. Okay, one of the things that isn't shown in that excerpt, but it's in the book itself, and they don't show it in the movie either, is Athena shows up and actually gives Achilles back his spear that after he throws it. So she kind of helps kill Hector in a way, because Achilles is getting help from Athena, and Hector isn't getting help from one of the gods. But there's two parts to that, right? It's how the gods are constantly intervening, but then there's also constantly brought up respect for the gods. We mentioned proper burial, that there was super important for this idea of, in order to get into the underworld, you had to cross the river, and you had to pay the ferryman or the boatman to do so. And so the way that you paid is that when you were buried, they put coins on your eyes to pay the ferryman, and that proper burial was connected to respect for the gods too, in that way. But so it was really important that you were buried properly so that you actually get that. And so you see Achilles threatening, saying, I'm going to make sure that you don't. And he did. He took him around. He drove off with his chariot. And then when he was at camp at the Greeks, every time he got sad, he went on his chariot and drove Hector's dead body around in the book. So he was not treated properly. And then I mentioned hubris. Hubris is a huge thing, and we're going to see that with Odysseus as well, a lot in the Odyssey. Hubris gets brought up a ton in the Odyssey. It is some in the Iliad. And hubris means excessive pride. And one of the things I mentioned is that, this was seen in the real world when Xerxes loses in the Persian War. The Greeks connect that to his excessive pride and actually say he lost because he had hubris, and they very much saw it as a negative thing that caused problems. So excessive pride, this was a negative that often led to downfall. And so it was taught, like I said, in Greek culture about avoiding hubris. So let's say we have the realities of war, honor and glory to be remembered, arete, which is excellence, time, which is the honor, the gods, proper burial, hubris, and then the one, I'll write the last couple. You have hospitality, which we don't see in the Iliad, and then women, which we do see in the Iliad. But I'll write more about them in it last. That'll be the last one, and I'll add hospitality when we get to that one. So what happens at the end with this? That's all the excerpts for this, right? This is from the extra credit option that you can do, but it's also good to get some ideas of that. What happens at the end of the war? So after this, of course, Achilles rejoins and things go downhill for the Trojans with Hector. However, they aren't ever breached. And the Greeks, kind of were like, what do? We obviously are not going to be able to breach their walls. Odysseus, who's often described as wise, which is why Athena tends to like him, I think, wise Odysseus. And so again, remember, they often put descriptors in front of the names in a lot of these stories. He comes up with the horse, the Trojan horse. He says, let's build this massive horse, which men can hide in, and we'll say we give up, they won, we'll put it as our parting gift, and then we'll pretend we're left. Then they'll hopefully celebrate and bring it in, and in the middle of the night we can sneak out and open the gates. And that's what happens. They claim that they are giving up, and here's the gift to their parting gift. The Trojans apparently don't think anything suspicious about this massive Trojan horse, and they bring it into their gates, close and lock the gates, and then get drunk and celebrate and party. While they're all passed out, the Odysseus and a few of the men that fit in there, which wasn't very many, sneak out, open the gates. The Greeks come in and slaughter everyone in Troy, and then Menelaus takes Helen back. But just before that, Priam actually visits. So that's not in the book, though. That's what happens at the end, but it's in a separate story. Actually, where the Iliad actually ends is with Priam. The war is continuing on, and Priam's Hermes. So here is again the gods intervening. Hermes goes and helps Priam sneak into the Greek camp to visit Achilles. So Priam, with the aid of Hermes, sneaks into Achilles' tent and waits for Achilles. Achilles comes back and is surprised to see him and is like, what are you doing here? And they end up actually having a talk about family, about the loss that warfare creates. And it's like this heartfelt talk about death, about loss. And in the end, Achilles, his anger has subsided by that point at some, and he ends up agreeing to give Hector's body back so he could be buried properly. So that's where the Iliad actually ends. So he does get that, and then again, like I said, then after that, the Trojan horse, and in that final onslaught, Achilles is killed. When an arrow is shot into his heel in his one weak spot, and he's killed, but all of Troy is destroyed. At least in that version. We'll see a later Roman version that claims a few people escaped Troy. So that's the Iliad. Then you have the Odyssey, right? So everyone celebrates. Menelaus goes home with Helen, although they decide to go raid a few places before they go home. Because apparently not enough fighting has taken place. And then Odysseus and his men set out, but they don't offer the proper sacrifices, again, respect to the gods, to Poseidon. And this pisses off Poseidon, and they get blown off course and end up through a series of different islands, essentially, that are all kind of like one disaster after another. But let's talk about hospitality, because we're going to see it with the Cyclops here and that island in just a second. Hospitality was an important thing. And it was this expectation that, okay, what happened here? Hang on, let me get the rest of the notes back. Okay, I got it back. Okay, so hospitality was this idea that you should always treat strangers and guests with respect. In fact, if a stranger or traveler came to your door, you were to invite them in, give them something to eat, give them let them have a bath, a place to rest before you even asked, who they were. Right? You were to say, what can I, guests, come on in, here's some food, here's a hot bath, and then, tell me your story. And the reason for this was that it was always a possibility that it was a god in disguise. And so the idea was that you always wanted to assume that, that there might be, you never knew if it was going to be a god, right? And so treat every stranger, every guest with hospitality. And of course that applied to people you knew too, that you were supposed to be, provide hospitality to those you knew. So we could add, that then this extended to those you knew, because even they could be gods in disguise. But it was just this idea of treating people with hospitality, and that often applied to travelers and guests, but just kind of in life in general. And the idea is that if you didn't, and then you insulted a god, right, there could be negative consequences. But that it also was just disrespectful to fail to follow that role of hospitality. And this was practiced in Greek culture. So we're going to see that in the Odyssey. Okay, so as I mentioned right at the beginning, it starts with Telemachus, and 10 years, actually not 10 years, almost 19 and a half years. It's always like the tail end of that, right? 10 years for the Trojan War, and then Odysseus is gone for 10 years. So 19 and a half years now have passed. Telemachus is a young man. Penelope is Odysseus's wife, and for the last several years, many years now, as like 5 years, I think at least, they have had a problem. They have suitors. These are young men that are living in the palace, that are from Ithaca, that are trying to marry Penelope, because everyone's saying, well, Odysseus must be dead at this point. They don't jump in right when everyone gets back and Odysseus is still gone. But, let's say 15 years, 5 years after everyone else has gotten back, pretty much people assume Odysseus is dead. And so they want to be king of Ithaca. And so they start living in the palace, and they eat up all of the food. They abuse the servants. They treat Telemachus horribly. They're rude. It talks about all of this. And Penelope has been stalling, because they say, look, it's been long enough. You need to get remarried for Ithaca, right? And rule Ithaca. Of course, completely just ignoring Telemachus as the prince of Ithaca, who really should be then the next king. And she's faithful to, and this will get into women, we'll do that one last. She's faithful to Odysseus, and she doesn't want to get remarried. And so she says, finally, like, they're putting pressure on her. The suitors are getting worse and worse. So finally she says, fine, I will marry one of you after I finish this mourning shroud that she's weaving for Odysseus. And so during the day she weaves the shroud, and at night when everyone's asleep she unravels part of it. So it's taking her a really long time, and they finally are getting to the point where they don't believe that she still should be weaving this. And then a guest arrives at the door, and all the suitors ignore the guest and actually insult the old man, who happens to be Athena in disguise. Telemachus comes down and notices that there's a stranger at the door that everyone's ignoring, and he rushes over and profusely apologizes and says, "I'm so sorry. Come on in, here's some food. What else can I get you? And then, tell me your story." And then, they talk, and that's when Athena convinces Telemachus to go to Menelaus to ask about his father, and then that when he goes there, and then you get some backstory, some story about Odysseus. You get Helen's there, and she's doing some sewing, some needlework off to the side, and then they kind of talk about her story, and Menelaus and others put a lot of blame on her for not only the war, but claim that she went around taunting, that she was suspicious that the men were in the horse, and so she uses the voices of their wives and taunts them. She claims, that she was under the spell of Aphrodite, so it wasn't really fair, right? So she tries to defend herself a little bit. Anyways, and then they tell the story of when they last heard about Odysseus and what he was off to do. And just kind of, they all are sad by the end of it. Then it goes to Odysseus, and stuff, and then he washes up on shore, tells his story, and then it gets into these stories. So one of the stories is a story of Cyclops, which we'll also talk about hospitality here. So we saw hospitality with the suitors. The suitors did not practice good hospitality. In fact, it was horrible hospitality, and they're going to end up dead, right? So there's a very negative consequence to failing to follow proper hospitality. And then in the Cyclops, we'll see this expectation of hospitality that both sides fail to a degree. You can fail at hospitality as the guest, and you can fail at hospitality as the person whose home it is. So this one is about the one in the Cyclops. The men, they land on the island, and they go and they see this cave that has food in it. They're hungry. They bring some wine and as like a gift and stuff. But bad hospitality here is Odysseus and his men just start eating the food, which that's not good hospitality, to show up at someone's home when they're not home and just go in and start eating their food. I mean, that's what the suitors were essentially doing. And then the Cyclops comes in and sees them, and gets upset that they're there eating his food. He rolls a boulder to block them in the cave, and then is like, what are you doing? And so they're all trapped, right? When the Cyclops had finished with all his work, he lit the fire, caught sight of us, and started asking questions. "Strangers, who are you? Where do you come from? Are you traders, or do you cruise the sea as roving pirates, attacking every man and taking on all rivals?" We were frightened out of our minds by his booming voice and the very sight of the monster, but I managed to say, "This is Odysseus. We are Greeks on our way home from Troy, but by the will of Zeus, we have been driven far off course by angry winds and a violent sea. We are part of the army of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, who made himself famous throughout the whole world by destroying so great a city and killing so many people. We therefore humbly ask you to take us in." Here's the hospitality, right? "As of any visitor might reasonably expect, for we are your supplicants, and as you know, this is in accordance with the will of the gods. For Zeus is the protector of travelers and guards their way by enforcing the rights of those in need." To this he scorned me with pitiless answer. "Stranger," said he, "you are a fool, or else you know nothing of this country, as if you would preach to me about fearing and respecting the gods. We Cyclopses don't care all about Zeus or any of your blessed gods, since we are so much stronger than they. I will not spare you or your men out of any regard for Zeus unless I feel like it. Now tell me where you moored your ship when you came on shore. Was it up the coast, or is she lying just offshore?" Odysseus says, "He was trying to gain advantage over me, but I understood the world well enough to see through him. So I answered, 'Poseidon,' said I, hurled my ship onto the rocks as far end of your country and wrecked it. We were thrown onto them from open sea. but I and those who are with me escaped the jaws of death. So he realized, Odysseus is often described as wise. Odysseus recognizes that the Cyclops is trying to figure out where their ship is, probably to take it or destroy it, so he pretends that their ships have been destroyed already. Then it says, the cruel monster gave no reply, but he suddenly grabbed 2 of my men at once and dashed them down upon the ground as though they had been puppies. Their brains spilled out on the ground and their blood drained into the earth. Then he tore them limb from limb and ate them for dinner. Right, so this is a failing hospitality. So the Odysseus and his men failed hospitality by showing up, and it's not in the excerpt, they cut that part off, but they failed by showing up and eating the Cyclops' food before he was home. The Cyclops fails by eating them, right? That's bad hospitality, to eat your guest. We could do nothing in reaction to this horrendous sight except cry and lift our hands to Zeus. After the Cyclops had filled his huge belly and washed it down with milk, he stretched himself on the ground. So then Odysseus comes up with a plan. Look, Cyclops, I said you've been eating a lot of human flesh. So drink some of this excellent wine that we've stored on board our ship. I thought of offering to you in the hope that you would have compassion and help me on my way home. But you are just a savage and I'm sick of it. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. How can you expect people to visit if you treat them this way? He ends up drinking the wine, which Odysseus wants him to do, and he fills it up multiple times. He's trying to get him drunk. Cyclops, this is Odysseus still. Cyclops, you asked my name, and I will tell it to you. In return for the present you promised me. My name is Nobody. This is what my father and mother and all my friends have always called me. But the cruel monster replied, then I will eat all of Nobody's comrades before him, and will save Nobody for last. That shall be your gift. As he spoke, he staggered around the room and fell into a drunken stupor, sprawling his face on the ground. Right, so that's this is the clever part, right? Because the Cyclops previously had asked him his name, and so then he ends up telling him later, "My name is Nobody," and you'll see why in a minute. And so he's drunk, and then what Odysseus does is he takes this wooden pole and he heats it up in the fire while the Cyclops is passed out. I immediately thrust a wooden pole deep into the ashes of the fire to heat it, and encouraged my men to make sure none would turn coward and abandon me. Even though the wood was green, it was now glowing fiercely with heat, so I pulled the pole out of the fire just before it blazed and gathered my men around me, for heaven had filled their hearts with courage. We drove the sharp end of the beam into the monster's eye, and pushing him down on it with all my weight, I kept turning it round and round as though I was boring a hole in the ship's plank with a drill. Right? Cyclopses are big giants with one eye. And so he blinded him. And so that they have a chance of escape. And then he wakes up from this shouting, and he shouts to the other Cyclopses who lived in the neighboring heights. And so they gathered on his cave, but remember he had the big boulder over his cave. What's wrong? They said, that you disturb our peace with your screaming and wake us up. Is someone trying to rob you or kill you? But Polyphemus shouted to them from inside the cave, it's Nobody's treachery. Nobody is killing me. See, there's the clever part, right? So when he's yelling, nobody is killing me, nobody is hurting me, they're like, well, why are you yelling and waking us up then? Then if nobody is attacking you, you must be sick. Sickness comes from Zeus, and you can't do anything about it. All you can do is pray to your father, Poseidon, which this is important. Poseidon is his father. So, right, that was very clever. So when he called for help, and they didn't believe anyone was actually hurting him. It was just that he was sick, because Odysseus gave his name as Nobody. And so then they hide out until the next morning. All of the Cyclops' sheep, by the way, were inside, so they didn't get eaten by predators. So the Cyclops has to roll back the boulder to let his sheep out. And what they end up doing is they end up tying themselves in the right before morning to the underside of these big sheep, because they're big sheep, I guess, because the whole island is of giants and the Cyclopses and large things. And in trying to prevent them from escaping, the Cyclops, who's now blind, feels the sheep to make sure only sheep are leaving the cave. But unbeknownst to him, they're tied underneath, and they escape. And they get all the way down to their ships. And then this is the hubris, right? So this is where Odysseus shows hubris and almost gets them screwed because of what he does, and actually does because of what he continues to do here. So they get to the ship. They're free and clear. At this point, Odysseus should have just gotten on the ship and they should have taken off. But he can't let it go. That's that excessive pride. When they're at the ship, he yells, "Cyclops," I yelled, "you should have realized that the man you were taunting, whose friends you were eating in your own house, was no weakling. And now you are paying for all your vicious crimes. Now Zeus and all the gods have punished you." So he's claiming, right, his failure at hospitality and eating people has led to him being blinded. That's the punishment from the gods. He got more and more furious as he heard me, so he tore off the top of a high mountain and flung it just in front of our bow. Our bow, that's the ship, right? So Odysseus almost ends up having the ships destroyed because he had to taunt the Cyclops rather than just leave. I signaled for the men they must row for their lives. And then he yells again, and this is the second part that gets him in massive trouble. "Cyclops, if anyone asks you who put your eye out and condemned you to such a deformed blindness, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca." So it's essentially like he just gave the Cyclops his name, phone number, email address, and social security number with that list. Remember, who is his father? The Cyclops' father, Poseidon, who they are on ships on the sea. Poseidon is the god of the sea. And Odysseus not only almost got their ships destroyed from the Cyclops throwing things in their direction, but then he tells them his name and who he is. Well, you know what happens? Cyclops talks or prays to his father, and then Poseidon makes the journey impossible for them to ever get home. In fact, the gods have to intervene to finally get Odysseus. All of Odysseus' men end up dying, basically because of this hubris. And Odysseus is going to change sorry, after he gets through the underworld. Like the underworld kind of changes him, and then he becomes becomes more humble and more thoughtful, and doesn't have that kind of hubris anymore. And probably like him losing so many men helps with that too. But really the reason that it takes him 10 years to get home is because of Poseidon. So they go on a variety of, after the Cyclops, they do get away. They go to a couple different islands. They're all bad. And one you have you have Calypso and Circe, the two different women. One turns the men into pigs before Odysseus is able to escape and have some of his men turn back. And then in the other island, which is the very last island, so the underworld's in between that, but the very last island, he ends up staying with the goddess for 5 years. So 5 years is like their actual adventure, and then 5 years is with just him. All of his other people have died. He has sex with her. He's happy there for a while, but eventually he starts moping around, and she tries to keep him there. And the gods send messengers saying, like, you got to let him go. And she doesn't want to. And she's like, so she says, I can make you immortal. I can make you a god, and you can stay with me forever. And he says, no, I miss my wife and my son. I need to go back, because if I stay here, even if I'm immortal, like actually a god and an immortal, people will forget who I am. The only way I'll be remembered and my name will be remembered is if I go back to Ithaca. So one of the things, of course, we'll see the difference, right, is like Odysseus has sex with women on this journey, mostly the demigods, the Circe and Calypso. And both of them end up trying, one changes his men into pigs, and the other one tries to keep them on the island forever. But right, so those are the negative views of women in that sense, as these smaller deities. But that really his motivation is, yes, he misses his wife to a degree, but it's also just that he wants to be remembered, and he won't be remembered, doesn't believe he'll be remembered if he doesn't make it back to Ithaca. Right, all these various islands all have misfortune for the men, and each island they go to, people die. Well, one of the things that he wants to do is he goes to the underworld. So that was before the last island, and that's this one here, Odysseus in the underworld. And after the underworld, he does become more humble, like I said, and he's more careful and less, he doesn't risk the men's life as much. Nonetheless, they all are going to end up dead anyway. So in this one here, he goes and he sees, the first person he sees is Agamemnon. And he sees Agamemnon, and he says, "Oh, how did you die? Did Poseidon raise the winds against you when you were at sea? Or was it on the mainland when you were stealing their cattle and sheep, or while you were fighting them for their wives and cities?" Right here, this is that, right, Mycenaean raiding. Remember we talked about the Mycenaeans, both raided and traded and stuff. And so he's asked, like, oh, after the war, did you go and raid and fight, or did you die at sea? And he says, Odysseus, my wicked wife Clytemnestra plotted my destruction. Remember we talked about the plays and Agamemnon's fate. Clytemnestra killed him because he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia. So here it's telling us about it, right? My wife Clytemnestra plotted my destruction and finished the job together with Aegisthus, was her boyfriend, essentially. He opened his home to me and set out a feast, then butchered me as a man fells an ox at slaughter. That was my miserable end. And so then here, this is about women too, right? Believe me, there is nothing in this world so cruel as a shameless, and so shameless as a woman who can contemplate such deeds. For who could imagine so hideous a crime as the deliberate butchery of her husband? But the depth of her abominable crime has brought disgrace on herself and on all women, even the honest ones who shall come ever after. And I said, it's true that Zeus has hated the house of Atreus from the beginning through the deception of wickedness of women. See how many of us fell for Helen's sake. And now it seems it was Clytemnestra who hatched the plot against you while you were away in Troy. Absolutely right, continued Agamemnon. So don't be too gentle even with your own wife. Do not tell her that all that you know perfectly well yourself. Tell her a part only and keep the rest to yourself. Not that your wife Odysseus is likely to murder you. Penelope is a remarkable woman with an excellent nature. We left her a young bride with an infant at her breast when we set out for Troy. So let me give you a word of advice, and I hope you will take it to heart. Do not sail directly into port when you get close to Ithaca, but move in carefully, secretly. Women, I tell you, are never to be trusted. Right? So you have this very negative view of women. Again, you have Calypso, Circe, Helen, Clytemnestra, all these negative women that are then responsible for this idea of destruction of men, that they cause destruction and death, and that they are dangerous. But it's just it's very negative, right? Women are not to be trusted, right? I tell you, women are never to be trusted, and that this idea of that, disgrace on women, all women, including the honest ones, wickedness, right? It's all the very negative terms for that. And then so that's the warning he gets from Agamemnon. My wife killed me. Don't trust your wife. And then he sees Achilles as he's talking to Agamemnon in the underworld. And he says, as for you, Achilles, no one was ever so fortunate as you have been, nor ever will be, for you were adored by all of us as long as you were alive. And now you are here. You are a great prince among the dead. Why are you still so bitter? Because when he sees Achilles, Achilles is not happy. Spare me your praise of death, he answered. I would rather be a slave on earth in the house of some poor man than a king in hell among those who are done with life. Now, hell is translated here because the Greeks didn't have a concept of hell or heaven. Everyone just went to the underworld. But and they didn't give you the whole thing here, but it is significant, right? Achilles made the decision to go to Troy knowing he was going to die so that he could have the honor and glory and be remembered. Now that he's died, you're getting, in the Odyssey, you're getting a different theme that's basically saying, I would rather have not been remembered than to be dead, right? I would rather be a slave in the house of some poor man than a king in the underworld. Right, so this idea of that life is better, life is important. So, like I said, you kind of get this dichotomy between those two things, and some perspective of like, I was wrong, that this should not be the most important thing. Of course, Odysseus doesn't necessarily take that to heart because, it's what pushes him forward to go home. But in that sense, it isn't a bad thing. But this part is what starts to humble him, because it talks about the importance of life. That at least you shouldn't be seeking out death. And ultimately, right, he's more careful with his crew and trying to not get them killed, even though it doesn't ultimately work. So I think that was a key shift in his change of realizing that, you know, that you should value, you should want to live, you should be valuing life, and that the underworld isn't some great thing to rush into. And so then, like I said, then he goes on the rest of his journey. All of the other men end up dying from their various, travels. And then he ends up on the island for 5 years with the goddess before finally the gods intervene and force her to let him go. He finally leaves, lands on the beach naked and almost dead when he sees the princess, goes to the city and then retells their tale. And then after he shares his story, he heads to Ithaca. And then he has the gods, Athena disguises him. But he meets his son Telemachus and tells him who he is, and then Telemachus tells him about the suitors. And I won't read these because of just time and stuff, but what ultimately happens is that then he tells the suitors he tells them about the suitors and the fact that they're taking over the house and all of that. And Odysseus with his son, they end up killing all of the suitors. So, right, the fact they failed hospitality, and then they failed it again when Odysseus shows up. They see him as an old beggar man, because that's his disguise, and they abuse him and treat him poorly. So he even gave him one more chance to leave or to be respectful, and when they fail that final time, he slaughters all of the suitors. And that's meant to show, again, the consequences of failing hospitality is significant. The Cyclops is blinded. Odysseus and his men are thrown off track for many, many years, and then all of his men die. And then the suitors die because of their lack of it. Okay, so that's that. I'm leaving women because I'm gonna add. Let's put a few things there, but I'm gonna add to women because it goes a little bit more than that. What's going on with that? There we go. But this idea of that you have, very few positive views of women. Lots of negative. And I mean, the positive ones that we see here, it talks about loyalty, there's a lot of emphasis on needlework and weaving, being faithful, right? Those type of things. But the negative, right, a lot of the times the emphasis on is this idea of independent women as a danger to men. Right, and that the idea that Helen or Clytemnestra or Circe were independent and they were making their own choices, and when they aren't under male authority, it leads to bad things. To, we'll say, destruction of some kind. And then just in general, this negative view of women as untrustworthy and wicked. All right, now we're going to get into more specifics with Pandora's box. Right, so let's see, that's 3. We'll do Pandora's box here, and kind of talk about women. And just solidify that whole aspect of kind of those roles of women. Okay. All right, with Pandora's box, so you have works and labor. This just excerpt here. Real quick with this, Hesiod was writing when there is a transition. We'll talk about this with the Archaic period, but one of the significant changes in the transition from the Dark Ages to the Archaic period was that you had colonization, and that because of the lack of land, there was an issue with land. There wasn't a lot of space. I mentioned this with the Minoans when I was talking about them. The land was good for some farming, but there was, there's a lot of rocky cliffs and edges and it was really good for like vine agriculture, olives, grapes. So they made wine and olives. But as far as for wheat and grain, it wasn't. And Greece had a policy of dividing the land equally amongst the sons, but this only takes a few generations to have land end up being divided so small that it doesn't support people. And so one of the things that happens in the Archaic period is people began going out and going to other islands and surrounding areas and colonizing those and creating city-states. And this creates long-distance trade. And so many people ended up making their money through colonization and long-distance trade. Hesiod is definitely kind of that old school character who is reacting to colonization and is against it. And also just this kind of sense of like that the gods created us to labor and work hard. So he talks about both gods and men are angry with men who live idle, and that you're supposed to constantly work. He also says wealth should not be seized. God-given wealth is much better. And so you shouldn't take it violently, which is like the looting and stealing and things like that. But also when a man has by him at home does not trouble him, it is better to have your stuff at home, for whatever is abroad may mean loss. All of this is kind of that anti-colonization. The idea that if you're just trading, if you're making your money through trade and colonization, then you're not working hard. It's very much this like pro-farming idea, and that other work is not really, you're not doing the hard labor that the gods intended. And so you have this conflict that's going on just because of the transition of cultural structure that's taking place between the Dark Ages and the Archaic period. But then he talks about women here in this one, along with Pandora's box, right? Don't let a flaunting woman coax and cozen and deceive you. She is after your barn. The man who trusts womankind trusts deceivers. So again, we have that language. We have that language with Agamemnon, that don't trust women. They're not trustworthy. And then here, the man who trusts women trusts deceivers. Then he says, first of all, get a house and a woman and an ox for the plow, a slave woman, not a wife. So again, it's this very anti-wife, anti-woman sentiment. But Pandora's box, we see this most clearly. Okay, so the first part of Pandora's box is about why Pandora is created. For the gods kept hidden from men the means of life. Else you would easily do enough work in a day to supply you for a full year, even without working. Soon you would put away your rudder over the smoke, and the fields worked by ox and sturdy mule would run to waste. And so Zeus hid it. What is it? It doesn't tell us right away, but it's fire. So there's this idea that the gods, Zeus specifically, hid fire from men, because if they had fire, then you would get work done easily and fast, and it would be too easy and everyone would become lazy. Again, Hesiod's kind of anti-lazy. Anything lazy is bad. Well, Prometheus was a Titan, and Prometheus stole the fire. And because Prometheus stole the fire and gave it to man, he planned sorrow and mischief against men. That's Zeus. So he stole fire and gave it to men. So Zeus is pissed that Prometheus stole it, and Prometheus ends up getting punished. Prometheus gets chained to a high cliff, and then like the eagles and big birds come and basically peck away and eat his intestines every day. But because he's a god, then he heals at night, and then it's repeated every day. So Prometheus got massive torture for doing this. So you feel bad for Prometheus, because he kind of got screwed in that whole thing. He gives men fire and then gets internally tortured, whereas like people, they apparently, it shows here that Pandora is bad for him, but like it doesn't seem comparable. Like Prometheus gets the raw end of the deal here with this. So Zeus is pissed that fire was stolen from him and given to men. And the son of Hephaestus is Prometheus. He says, surpassing all in cunning, you are glad that you have outwitted me and stolen fire. A great plague to you yourself and to men that shall be. And then here's what he says. This is why he's creating Pandora. But I will give men as the price for fire an evil thing, in which they may be all glad of heart while they embrace their own destruction. Okay, and then that's why he's creating Pandora, as punishment for taking the fire from Prometheus. But and then specifically says he's going to create something that men will gladly accept, but they'll happily embrace, they'll accept, but they're actually accepting their own destruction. So said the father of men and gods, and laughed aloud. And he bade famous Hephaestus, right, the smith maker, the metal worker, make haste and mix earth with water and put it into the voice and strength of humankind, and fashion a sweet, lovely maiden shape, like the immortal goddess in face. Right, so Hephaestus creates the general body and face of Pandora. So all of the gods take part in this. Athena to teach her needlework and weaving, and the golden Aphrodite shed grace upon her head, but also cruel longings and cares that weary the limbs. And he charged Hermes, the guide, the slayer of Argus, to put in her shameless mind and deceitful nature. And so he ordered, and they obeyed the Lord Zeus, so son of Cronos, forthwith. They molded clay in the likeness of a modest maid, as Zeus, son of Cronos, proposed. And the goddess bright-eyed Athena girded and clothed her, and the divine graces and queenly persuasion put necklaces of gold upon her, and the rich-haired Hours crowned her head with spring flowers. Athena bedecked her form with all manners of finery, and Argos contrived within her lies and crafty words and a deceitful nature, and he called this woman Pandora. So these here are the descriptors and one thing here of Pandora. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So this is all just describing, right, all the things they did to create her. And I mentioned there's two parts to this. There's the facade and the reality. So we'll look at those. But then when they'd finished that sheer hopeless snare, the father sent glorious Argus slayer, which is Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, to take it to this guy as a human, as a gift. And he did not think on what Prometheus had said to him, bidding him never take a gift of the Olympian Zeus, but to send it back for fear it might prove to be something harmful to men. So here's the thing. Prometheus warned them, don't take gifts from Zeus. It's gonna turn out bad. And then they forgot, saw Pandora, and happily took her. But when he took the gift, and afterwards, when the evil thing was already his, he understood. So that's that, right? Now it explains what the curse of Pandora is, besides just being a woman, which kind of sounds like what the curse is. It's just being a woman. Here's your curse. For ere this, the tribes of men lived on earth, remote and free from ills and toil and heavy sickness. So it says before Pandora, men were free of sickness and ills and hard toil of earth. For misery men grow old quickly. But the woman took off the great lid of the jar. We call it Pandora's box, but it was actually a jar. And by opening the jar, so they gave her a jar when they gave her to men and said basically, don't open it. And then she did. All of these, that her hand scattered all these, and her thought caused sorrow and mischief to men. Only hope remained there in the unbreakable home under the rim of the great jar, and did not fly out. But the rest, countless plagues, wander amongst men, for earth is full of evils and the sea is full. Diseases come upon men continually by day and night, bringing mischief to mortals silently. Right, all these bad things happened. They all flew out of that didn't exist for humankind, now did. Sickness, disease, plague, evil, because they were all in that jar, which Pandora was told not to open, but because she opened it, only hope remained. And then it's the moral of the story is, so there's no way to escape the will of Zeus, right? Which is definitely a big moral. Don't mess with Zeus because you're going to get screwed. So let's look at, I highlighted them here a bit, right? Because I asked you to look at what were the facade, what was the reality. And so you have these words that were described for the positive and then the negative. So here, right, Pandora created to punish the humans because they stole fire, or Prometheus did, but you know, same thing, from Zeus. And all of the gods helped create two, we'll say, natures or sides in her. And so you have the facade is the positive. This becomes the ideal woman. In everything in Greek literature, the facade characteristics that are listed in Pandora are described in what we saw in the Odyssey and Iliad of how they describe women. The facade is that ideal woman that doesn't happen very often. And then the reality of Pandora is seen as what most women were like. And think about Helen, Clytemnestra, Circe, Calypso, right? These lists will fit. So we have, for the facade, the positive language that was used. Well, and so these could also just be looks too. Necklaces of gold. The idea is, right, that she looks nice. Manners of finery, right? That was on the list. They called her sweet. They talked about lovely maiden shape, or sweet lovely maiden shape, right? You have needlework, and both Hector's wife and Penelope are described being good at needlework and weaving. And even Helen, after she's returned, is described in the corner doing needlework. And that's mentioned over and over again as like the ideal thing a woman, besides giving birth to your children, that's what she should be doing. Right? They described her as being bedecked with grace. It's mentioned that she looks like a modest maid. She has a beautiful face, right? Aphrodite gives her a beautiful face. You could put crown of flowers. That one maybe doesn't fit. There was the same, but right, this is the ideal woman in Greek culture. And then you have all the negative, right? The true nature of women. So you have lies, crafty words. Right, and I'm just pulling these from that list. If you go back to see what I circled or squared, the circled ones are the positive, the squared ones are the negative. Those are all pulled directly from those paragraphs, mostly from the 2 paragraphs, and a few from one from before and a few from after, but the majority are coming from that list. So I'm just putting these words directly from that reading. That is a deceitful nature. Cruel longings, cares that weary the limbs. This could be the idea of, right, just that women are exhausting or nagging. Shameless mind. You have that she's called a hopeless snare. She's also called a plague, causing sorrow and harmful to men, right? And you see that if you go back to the Odyssey and Iliad for a minute with the underworld, right? She brought disgrace on herself and all women to come. He says that Zeus has hated the house of Atreus, right? And the wickedness of women. Don't trust women, right? You have all those same language. And then this is how the view, the Greek view of women, most of the time, the Greek view of most women. Right, so it's not very positive. I mean, it's very negative in that sense. But so that's what we get. So that you have Pandora, between Pandora's box and the Odyssey and the Iliad, you have this role of women shaping into this very kind of specific structure. And just to show you how it lasts, I'm not going to read the whole thing because we're going to look at this more with classical Greece. So this was created in the Dark Ages and written down at the beginning of the Archaic period. This poem here, Women by Simonides, was written in the classical period, right? So we have hundreds of years now, and this is the poem. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it just goes on and on. From the start, the gods made women different. One type is from a pig, a hairy sow, whose house is like a rolling heap of filth, and she herself, unbathed in unwashed clothes, reposes on the shit pile growing fat. Another type the gods made from a fox, pure evil and aware of everything. This woman misses nothing, good or bad. She notices, considers, and declares that good is bad and bad is good. Her mood changes from one moment to the next, and it keeps going on. One type is from a dog, a no-good bitch, a mother through and through. She wants to hear everything, know everything, go everywhere, and stick her nose in everything and bark whether she sees anyone or not. A man can't stop her barking, not with threats, not when he's had enough by knocking out her teeth with a stone, nor with sweet talk either. Even among guests she'll sit and yap. The onslaught of her voice cannot be stopped. One type the gods of Mount Olympus crafted out of earth, their gift to man. This is Pandora. She's lame and has no sense of either good or bad. She knows no useful skill except to eat. And when the gods make winter cold and hard, to drag her chair up closer to the fire. Again, it goes on and on and on. And we'll look more at this later. But it goes on and on and on. And all of these are negative, like what we just read, right? The only one that's good in here is this one. Another type is from a bee. Good luck in finding such a woman. Only she deserves to be exempt from stinging blame. The household that she manages will thrive, a loving wife besides her loving man. She'll grow old, having borne illustrious and handsome children. Again, right, children is one of the few things that women are supposed to do. She herself shines bright among all women. Grace, there's one of those words that was on Pandora's the facade, envelops her. She doesn't like to sit with other women discussing sex. Zeus gratifies mankind with these most excellent and thoughtful wives. One positive description of women. All these other examples are bad and very, very negative of how women are horrible. And sure, this is kind of sounds like it, the way it's written is meant to be a satire and a tongue-in-cheek, but nonetheless, we see this over and over again in examples. And I'm out of time, so I will start the next lecture with expanding on women because there's more to talk about in how they're viewed and the different roles, but this gets you an introduction into it. And helps you with the Pandora assignment as well. So next time, I will write up a thing about women, and then we're going to be looking at the Archaic period. I'll probably just do a separate lecture just for women to expand a little bit further on, so I can bring back and talk about Pandora and the Odyssey, and then look at it a little bit more, because I do want to at least put out the main points for that. So it'll probably be a shorter lecture for that on women, because it'll just be its own separate thing. But then we're also going to be looking at the Archaic period and the things that changed in the Archaic period, and then Sparta and Athens.